or that crisp white envelope shattering my peaceful Sunday morning. I nearly knocked over my coffee, rushing to pick it up, already half convinced it was bad news. Isn't it always when an official notice from the Homeowners Association arrives out of nowhere? I knew it wasn't the annual dues, those I'd paid last month. With a guarded sigh, I tore open the envelope, and right there in plain print was the directive. My house's exterior color did not meet neighborhood standards. They wanted me to change it pronto. Now, I admit, my house wasn't exactly the picture of suburbia. When I first moved in, I'd chosen an odd shade of green that reminded me of the hillside pines near my favorite lake. Could I have picked something more standard like soft taupe or creamy shell? Sure, but I liked the color. And it's not like I was painting a giant mural of Elvis on the side. Still, the letter made it sound like I'd done something truly offensive. You'd think I'd erected neon signs proclaiming my yard was a carnival. I'd had my share of run-ins with the HOA before, mostly over petty things like the mailbox height and once over a vintage windmill lawn ornament I'd found at a garage sale. This new edict felt like the last straw. Part of me wanted to tell them exactly where to stick that letter. But I'm not a reckless person by nature. I'm retired from a long career as a high school science teacher, and patience was once my strong suit. In my younger days, I'd calmly remind mischief-making teenagers that there were consequences for every action. But something about this mandate set me off. The more I read their rules, the more outraged I became. It was never enough to just pay the fees. No, they wanted total compliance. That's why I decided to get creative. I spent the rest of that morning stewing. The letter demanded I repaint the house within 60 days or face an escalating fine. Standard stuff for an HOA, sure, but the ultimatum rubbed me the wrong way. I wandered over to my living room window and stared at the neighboring houses. All the shutters were identical. The roofs looked as if they'd been installed in a single day by the same contractor. Each yard had a pristine row of daisies, about 2 feet tall, spaced the same distance apart. If I didn't know better, I'd think I'd wandered into some bizarre, step-forward version of suburbia. I refused to let them bully me into a uniform aesthetic without at least having some fun. Was I being stubborn or rebellious? Maybe both. But something in my gut told me it was time for a stand. Living under HOA scrutiny has always felt a bit claustrophobic. So many rules, so many guidelines. Everyone nods along until you step out of line, and then you're singled out like a stray sheep wandering too far from the flock. I hopped online and scrolled through an endless rainbow of paint samples. The usual suspects, beige, light gray, slate off-white, bored me. Some were downright identical. Next, I considered something scandalous like flamingo pink or electric purple. But I kept coming back to the letter. Your home's appearance must conform to the natural setting of our community. Natural setting. They wanted me to pick a color that would blend with nature. Fine. I make my house blend in with nature. All right. So much so that it practically disappeared. That's where the camouflage idea was born. Camouflage is, after all, designed to blend in perfectly with the environment. And oh, how I grinned when I imagined the reaction of the HOA board. Their eyes bulging as they realized I'd met their demand in the most literal sense possible. I have a bit of an artistic side, though it rarely emerges from my comfortable routine of crosswords, library visits, and gardening. But this was big, bold, and decidedly out of the ordinary. Of course, it wasn't just a matter of picking a paint color and slapping it on. Camouflage is all about intricate patterns, swaths of green, brown, sometimes black, layered to mimic the shapes and shadows found in nature. My wife, Martha, though no longer here with me, had always encouraged my creative streak. She'd have found this downright hilarious. I could almost hear her voice in the back of my head, urging me on. Yet, I had to be cautious. A legal fight with the HOA was the last thing I wanted. While the camouflage scheme appealed to my mischievous sense of humor, there was also a genuine question. Could this type of paint job pass muster under their natural setting clause? Technically, if done tastefully, wouldn't camouflage be the ultimate earth tone palette? I typed up a quick email to the HOA, outlining my plan. I propose a repaint in multiple shades of green, brown, and tan, reminiscent of the local flora. I didn't mention the word camouflage. I didn't want them turning me down before I'd even started. Then, with a sense of rebellious satisfaction, I hit send. Moments later, I even felt a small pang of anxiety. What if they flat out refused? I spent the next few days waiting, checking my inbox, bracing for a scolding or another letter. Strangely, there was silence. A week passed. Maybe they were busy harassing someone else about the color of their front door. Or maybe they were conferring among themselves, trying to figure out how best to respond. Either way, I took their lack of an immediate no as an opening. It was time to get the gears in motion, to design a paint scheme that would not only fulfill their nature-themed requirement, but elevate it to a whole new level. Planning a camouflage paint job turned out to be far more complicated than I'd first anticipated. It wasn't like slopping on a single shade and calling it quits. If I wanted it to look authentic, not some half-baked parody, I needed to do my research. So I pulled out my old biology textbooks and nature guides. I even went hiking in the small patch of woods near the neighborhood, snapping pictures of tree bark, moss, and fallen leaves. The aim was to replicate the natural tones, shapes, and patterns I observe in the forest. I found inspiration everywhere. The mottled patterns on a log, the speckled camouflage of a praying mantis, even the layered look of lichen on rocks. It made me feel oddly young again, like a student on a science fair project, full of excitement and curiosity. I knew the HOA wanted me to keep it natural, but I doubted they'd envision me climbing through underbrush at age 65, collecting color swatches from nature's palette. The planning stage also included searching for a painting crew who'd be open-minded, or at least discreet, enough to tackle this unusual request. I called up half a dozen local contractors. Some laughed outright, one actually hung up on me, and a few politely declined, saying their schedule was backed up. Right, I'm sure. Finally, a small father and son outfit, calling themselves Rivera and Sons Painting, agreed to meet me for a consultation. The father, Hector, sounded intrigued rather than dismissive. He'd grown up in a rural area where camouflage was common on barns, hunting cabins, and even old trucks. We set a date for him and his son, Felix, to come by the house. On the day of our appointment, I waited on the porch, feeling more like I was greeting co-conspirators than a pair of painters. Hector was a burly man with a warm grin. Felix, lanky and soft-spoken, looked like he was in his early 20s. They asked to see my notes, so I spread them out across the dining room table. Hand-drawn sketches, printed photos from my nature walks, plus a small color chart I'd meticulously annotated. Hector took his time flipping through the pages. "This is definitely different from our normal jobs," he said with a chuckle, glancing at Felix. "But I like it. It's a challenge." Felix looked up from a photo of tree branches and nodded earnestly. "I can freehand some of these shapes if we stencil the bigger areas first," he offered. "Then we can layer so it looks natural." The father and son duo had me excited. This could actually work. We spent the rest of the day mapping out a rough approach, discussing paint brands, which types of brushes and sprayers they'd need, and how much time it would take. Even if I had to pay extra for the complexity, it was worth every penny to see the look on the HOA's collective face when they realized I was playing by the rules while also pushing them to the limit. Naturally, as word spreads quickly in quiet suburbs, it wasn't long before my neighbors began to notice the unusual commotion at my house. Soon, they started dropping by, just to chat, though curiosity was clearly their motive. My next-door neighbor, Judith, a retired nurse with a penchant for crocheting, ambled over one afternoon, squinting at the array of paint cans in my driveway. "You're really painting it camouflage?" she asked, the skepticism plain in her voice. "All those different colors?" I offered a smile. "Sure am. The HOA wants me to match the natural environment. That's precisely what I'm doing." Judith folded her arms. "You know they'll hate this, right? They might fine you anyway." I shrugged. They could try. But the letter specifically said they want something that doesn't clash with the area. Camouflage is the most natural pattern there is, if you think about it. She pursed her lips, but ended up grinning. "Well, you've got gumption, I'll give you that. And if you need a witness when they come marching up your driveway, I'll be on my porch, knitting away." As the days went by, Hector and Felix began the preliminary work, stripping the old paint, smoothing the siding, applying a base coat of a pale greenish-brown. It already felt like we were ushering in something monumental. Each night, I'd stand in my yard, watching the sunset glow behind my half-painted house, imagining how it would look once fully adorned in its leafy, bark-like patterns. But quiet suburbs aren't known for letting sleeping dogs lie. It was inevitable that the HOA board would hear rumors about my unusual color choice. And sure enough, halfway through the prep work, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed the name Lori G. She was the board secretary, if memory served me right. For a moment, I debated letting it go to voicemail. But I'd known Lori for years. She was usually less abrasive than some of the other board members. "You're painting your house camouflage?" she asked the moment I picked up. I cleared my throat. "Hi, Lori. Yes, I am. I believe I mentioned using multiple earth tone shades to comply with the request to match the natural environment." There was a pause. "Well, that's something, all right. The board wants to have a look at your plan. Perhaps you can send us your color samples so we can review them before you go any further." I clenched the phone a little tighter. It was obvious they were getting cold feet, worried about what I'd do next. "Actually, I already emailed your office weeks ago about this." No one responded, so I assumed it was approved. Lori tried to sound official. "We must have missed the email. You understand, we've got a lot on our plate. But the board will be meeting next Thursday. Can you hold off on further painting until then?" I glanced at the new paint in progress and Hector up on a ladder, applying primer. Stopping now would leave me with a half-finished project and the distinct possibility the HOA could try to shut me down entirely. On the other hand, ignoring them might provoke a bigger fight. After a moment's thought, I said, "We'll hold off on the final detailing, but the base coat is already going on. It would cost me a fortune to delay." Lori sighed. "Fine. Just come prepared next Thursday to show your samples and explain how this meets our guidelines." "Understood," I said, forcing politeness into my voice. When I hung up, I felt a surge of tension. I known it wouldn't be a smooth road, but now it felt like the board was gearing up for an interrogation. Still, I reminded myself that I had logic on my side. Camouflage was literally designed to match the environment. If they wanted to fight, I was ready. And from the determined expression on Hector's face, I could tell he wasn't about to pack up his tools, either. The following Thursday arrived with a strange energy in the air. The board meeting was scheduled for 6 in the evening at the clubhouse, one of those overstuffed, artificially cheery venues with motivational posters lining the walls. It smelled faintly of musty carpet and stale coffee. Despite my nerves, I dressed casually, refusing to show up in a suit and tie like I was on trial. After all, I was the homeowner. I took a deep breath before stepping inside, color samples tucked neatly in a folder under my arm. Inside, a handful of residents milled about, waiting for the meeting to start. The HOA board members sat at a long folding table up front, Lori in the middle, flanked by Bob, the treasurer, and Cynthia, the vice president. The president of the HOA, Anthony Chambers, was conspicuously absent. He'd apparently called in sick, leaving Cynthia to officiate. I'd never quite seen eye to eye with Anthony. He'd once lectured me about the color of my garden hose, of all things. But if he wasn't there, maybe that was a good omen. I took a seat near the front, my foot tapping anxiously. After the usual agenda items, some talk about a new security gate and budget proposals. Lori cleared her throat. "Now, we have an item concerning an exterior repaint at 435 Mapleton Drive." All eyes turned to me, and my stomach did a small flip. "Would the homeowner please come forward to discuss the project with the board?" I rose, stepping to the makeshift podium like I was giving a speech in front of a high school assembly. If my years teaching adolescents had taught me anything, it was how to stay calm and exude confidence. I opened my folder and handed out copies of my carefully curated palette. Various greens, browns, and tans, each labeled with a brand name and color code. Then I showed them a few small sketches of how the pattern might look. Cynthia leaned forward, pushing her glasses up her nose. "So, you're essentially painting your house in a camouflage pattern?" "Correct," I replied. "It's a combination of earth tones, seamlessly blending with a natural environment." That was the request in the letter I received, to select a more appropriate, natural color scheme. I even pulled out the original HOA letter and read the line verbatim. She glanced at Bob, who scratched his head. "Well, I see a lot of different shades here," he said slowly. "Is that really in keeping with the neighborhood style?" I shrugged. I'd argue that each house in our neighborhood might be a single shade of beige or gray, but nature isn't a single color. The bark of a pine tree alone might have a dozen subtle hues. I'm trying to replicate the real thing. Lori cleared her throat. "While the board appreciates your creativity, we want to ensure that the final result doesn't look—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Doesn't look disruptive." "Disruptive?" I repeated. "This is camouflage. Its main purpose is to blend in." A few people in the audience snickered, but Cynthia rapped her gavel lightly. "We need to maintain a cohesive visual appeal," she said. "Could you simplify the pattern? Maybe reduce the number of colors?" I took a slow breath, trying not to lose my temper. If I reduce the pattern to 2 or 3 colors, it won't really be camouflage. It'll just be splotches of paint. I want this to look professional, not haphazard. A heavy silence settled over the room. Lori exchanged a glance with Cynthia, who fiddled with her pen. Finally, Bob sighed and spoke up. "Look, we all know there's some leeway in the guidelines for natural tones. And I suppose, technically, camouflage is an arrangement of natural colors. But is there any chance we can see a sample of what it looks like on the actual house, beyond just the base coat?" I seized the opening. "Yes. Hector, my painter, did a small patch test on the side of the garage. We've applied the pattern to a 2-foot by 2-foot area. You can take a look at it if you'd like. It's visible from the driveway. Everyone's welcome to drop by." Cynthia tapped her pen against the tabletop. "All right, we'll arrange for a brief site visit. If it matches what you're describing and doesn't stand out too sharply, then perhaps we can grant a variance." She paused, then fixed me with a stern look. "But we will need the full board approval. And if it's deemed too extreme, we might ask you to pick a simpler color." "Understood." I nodded, relieved I was at least getting a chance. "Understood." They moved on to the next agenda item, but I could feel the tension in the air. On my way out, a few neighbors patted my shoulder, whispering words of encouragement. Others avoided eye contact, as if fearing they might be caught in the crossfire. Outside, the sky was dark, dotted with stars. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The board hadn't flat out denied my plan, which meant I still had a fighting chance. The next morning, like clockwork, I found a small group of board members in my driveway, gawking at the patch of camouflage on the side of my garage. Cynthia stood with arms crossed, her expression guarded. Bob peered closely, nodding on occasion. Lori remained quiet, her eyes roving over the different shades. I offered them a friendly wave from my porch. Eventually, they wandered over to greet me. Cynthia cleared her throat. "It's detailed," she admitted. "You've certainly gone to a lot of effort." "I have," I replied, trying to sound calm instead of triumphant. "And remember, that's just a small patch. Once the entire house is done, the pattern will be cohesive. It won't look mismatched." Bob murmured something about never seen anything like this, while Lori took a photo with her phone, probably for the official records, or perhaps to show Anthony. I could tell they were torn between upholding the neighborhood's bland uniformity and appreciating the fact that my choice was, technically, within the guidelines. I just needed them to see reason long enough to get me to the finish line. As they left, Cynthia paused by my mailbox. "We'll schedule a formal vote next week," she said. "In the meantime, please, no further painting beyond the test patch." I smiled. "Sure thing," I lied, because Hector and Felix were set to arrive that very afternoon. Stopping now would leave me in limbo for weeks, possibly months, if the board decided to stall. And every day that passed meant more rumor mill chatter, more meddling from neighbors, more opportunities for the board to clamp down. No, I needed to press on, quietly perhaps, but definitely onward. They'd already seen the patch test. It's not like adding more of the same pattern would suddenly transform it into something different. That day, as the painters laid down the first wave of camouflage patterns across the back of the house, I felt an odd mix of glee and trepidation. Part of me knew I was courting trouble by ignoring the board's request to wait, but there was no turning back now. I wanted to see this through, and if the HOA decided to make an example of me, Well, I had a counterargument lined up. After all, they had demanded something that matched nature, and nature, with all its complexity, was exactly what I planned to deliver. 2 more weeks of covert painting passed. Hector and Felix worked early mornings and late afternoons, trying not to attract too much attention. But even with our best efforts, it was impossible to hide an entire paint crew. Neighbors often paused on their walks, staring at the emerging shapes on my walls. Curved lines in dark olive, splashes of tawny brown, jagged edges in a lighter, almost khaki hue. From a distance, it already looked like a forest scene melded onto siding. Judith, my crocheting neighbor, became my unofficial lookout. From her perch behind the begonias, she'd text me whenever she spotted Cynthia or Bob driving by in their SUVs, giving me enough time to shuffle the painters inside for a quick break. The cloak and dagger routine was exhausting, but exhilarating too. The house was transforming into something akin to a large, living canvas, and I was increasingly proud of the results. Finally, the day came for the official HOA board vote. They sent out a mass email instructing residents to attend a special meeting at the clubhouse, where the board would decide the fate of my paint job. The email carried an ominous tone, suggesting that certain aesthetic concerns must be addressed promptly to maintain community standards. The last line hinted at possible fines or corrective actions if the board ruled against me. Tension rippled through the neighborhood. That night, I arrived at the clubhouse to see a larger-than-usual crowd gathered. Neighbors, some curious onlookers, and the full HOA board, including Anthony, who had apparently recovered from his illness. He sat at the center of the table, arms folded, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Bob was off to his right, Cynthia to his left, and Lori near the edge, flipping through papers. The meeting began with Anthony clearing his throat. We have one main item on tonight's agenda: the exterior repaint of 435 Mapleton Drive, which is apparently in a camouflage pattern. He emphasized camouflage, as though it were a dirty word. We'll hear from the homeowner first, then the board will issue a ruling. Swallowing my nerves, I stepped forward. I had a stack of photos in hand, showing the nearly finished paint job. Of course, at this point, there was no hiding or reversing it. The entire house was cloaked in shades of green, brown, and tan, the patterns seamlessly merging at corners and edges. To my eyes, it looked incredible, almost as if the house might vanish if you stood in the right spot among the surrounding trees. I set the photos on the table in front of Anthony. He glanced at them, then slid them down to Cynthia. As you can see, I've utilized a palette consistent with the local environment. The shapes and lines are drawn directly from nature: leaves, branches, bark. This design meets the requirement of using natural colors and is intended to harmonize with the surroundings, not clash with them. Anthony leaned forward. But is it appropriate for a suburban neighborhood, or will it create an eyesore? I kept my composure. An eyesore, by definition, is something that stands out unpleasantly. Camo is designed to blend. In many respects, my house will stand out far less than someone's bright pink door or neon lawn decorations. A faint murmur of approval rose from the crowd. A few people chuckled. One of my neighbors called out, "He's got a point there." Anthony's brow furrowed. "We have rules for a reason, Mr. Daniels. To maintain a cohesive aesthetic. This is quite different from what the rest of the community has. But it falls within the color guidelines," I countered calmly. The same guidelines that the board asked me to follow when I was ordered to repaint. Cynthia interjected, her tone slightly softer. "We did ask for a natural color, but maybe we didn't anticipate how far you'd take it." "It's not about taking it too far," I said. "It's about fulfilling the exact requirement. The house is not fluorescent yellow or pitch black. It's a spectrum of earth tones. Now, I respect that this is unconventional, but new ideas often seem strange at first." Anthony grimaced, flipping through my photos again. "I'll admit, the craftsmanship looks professional, but it draws attention. People are talking. The HOA's job is to make sure the neighborhood remains desirable." "Desirable for who, exactly?" I asked, perhaps a bit more sharply than I intended. "Because some of us want a bit of personality in our homes. We don't want every street to be identical." The board told me to fix my house or face penalties. I did just that, only in my own unique way. Silence hung in the air like a hell breath. After several seconds, Cynthia cleared her throat. We should hear from the community. Does anyone have a strong opinion one way or the other? She asked, scanning the rows of neighbors. Judas stood up first. I think it's fantastic. And if the board punishes him for being creative while still following the rules, that sends a bad message to all of us. Who's next? Will we all have to get the same brand of mulch next year? Where does it end? A smattering of applause followed. Another neighbor, Roger, a retired truck driver, got up. I'm not a fan of camouflage myself, but I don't see how it violates any rules. If we want to stay consistent with the guidelines, we have to allow it. The crowd murmured in agreement. A few others echoed similar sentiments. Anthony looked out at the sea of faces, a scowl deepening on his own. He was losing the battle of public opinion. Finally, he held up his hand, waiting for quiet. This is precisely why we have a board, to make decisions that maintain property values and community standards. I don't appreciate being strong-armed by a vocal minority here. But Bob leaned over and whispered something in Anthony's ear, glancing at the small stack of papers in front of him. Perhaps it was the budget or the membership fees, or maybe the threat that a large swath of neighbors wouldn't take kindly to an unfair decision. Whatever Bob said made Anthony's shoulders sag. Cynthia seized the moment. I move that we approve a variance for Mr. Daniel's camouflage paint job, given that it adheres to an earth tone palette and does not present a documented violation of the HOA's stated color guidelines. Lori seconded the motion. A beat passed. Anthony glowered but finally muttered, "All in favor?" A chorus of eyes echoed through the room. Opposed? He let out a reluctant sigh. The motion passes. A wave of cheers erupted, and I exhaled with relief. As the meeting adjourned, a handful of neighbors approached me to offer congratulations. Even those who weren't enthusiastic about camouflage seemed pleased the board had made a fair decision. Anthony, however, brushed past without a word, a dark cloud hovering over him. I suspected he was already thinking of some other rule to brandish against me, but for now, I had my victory. Back at home later that evening, I gazed at my newly camouflaged exterior. The gentle porch light illuminated the intricate patterns, the layered colors and shapes. It looked both wild and strangely elegant, a testament to standing up for oneself in the face of rigid conformity. I grabbed a folding chair and sat outside, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on the bizarre journey the past few weeks had been. To think, all of this because they told me to repaint my house in a color that suited the neighborhood's natural setting. They probably expected a mild beige or a bland neutral. Instead, they got something that truly embraced nature, right down to the last leafy swirl and bark-like stripe. And as the late summer breeze rustled the trees overhead, I couldn't help but smile. In a world that often demands compliance and uniformity, it felt good, liberating even to create something that both stayed within the lines and bent them to my own creativity. My house might draw a few surprised glances from passersby, but hey, it was exactly what they'd asked for. And maybe, just maybe, someone else would be inspired to break free from those stifling guidelines and add their own personal touch, too. I raised my teacup toward the quiet, leafy darkness in a small, triumphant toast. Long live the camouflage house, and here's to never letting the HOA dull my sense of color again. The end.